love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 37. Her I Love Best. Hello, husband.
Hello, my living darling.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Well, this is a very sweet chapter.
It is.
The penultimate chapter.
It's the actual penultimate chapter.
Actual penultimate chapter.
Finally.
We're getting close.
Yeah.
We're getting toward the end.
And what a chapter, right?
Wow.
It's a great one.
Yeah, it was. I found myself getting emotional. You don't think about that when you read a book. I guess I don't think about that when I read a book. But we talked about it on this show before, and I'm sure it'll come up as we talk on this episode, that I see so many parallels between our relationship and theirs, in the sense that I kind of get some of the, not inspiration, but I kind of see...
Is it the same emotional connection?
Well, I just, without sounding too self-deprecating, I kind of find myself, as I was getting older, wondering, like, who's going to find me? Where am I going to find love? And I did, and you found me, and the way that you feel about me seems to sort of echo the way that Jane feels about Rochester sometimes.
Well, that's very true.
And I feel the same way that Rochester feels about Jane. I feel the same way about you.
Yeah. Oh, this chapter is just so sweet.
Before we get into it, before we get into talking about Jane Eyre, how about we talk about talking about Jane Eyre?
Me talking about Jane Eyre?
Like you just did on a podcast.
Yes. I just wanted to share with our listeners that I was a guest on a new podcast called Care So Much, which is hosted by Lillian, who is also the co-host of a Jane Eyre-related podcast that we talked about before called Air Buds.
Air Buds. I wish it was about the movie Air Bud. That's what it should have been about. But
maybe eventually, who knows?
Yes.
But yeah, so Lillian had me on to talk about something that I care so much about, which is Jane Eyre. And it was a great conversation where we just kind of went over everything that I love about it and why I love it so much. So if you're interested, it's on all your regular podcast platforms, on Instagram and other social media. It's Care So Much Pod, and please enjoy.
Yeah. In case you didn't already know, Charlene likes talking about Jane Eyre.
Oh, yeah. I do obsess over it just a tiny bit, as our listeners may recognize.
Yeah, and we joked about it, but you were talking to Jane Eyre about me on our first date.
I mean, not immediately, just so we put that out there.
No, but it was, you even asked me, have you read it? You read it? And I'm like, sadly, no. That would change a few months later, but yeah.
Right.
And then now I got a chance to read it again. So here we are. Penultimate chapter. Charlene, hit us with the Spark Notes summary, chapter 37.
Jane goes to Ferndean. From a distance, she sees Rochester reach a hand out of the door, testing for rain. His body looks the same, but his face is desperate and disconsolate. Rochester returns inside, and Jane approaches the house. She knocks, and Mary answers the door. Inside, Jane carries a tray to Rochester, who is unable to see her. When he realizes that Jane is in the room with him, he thinks she must be a ghost or spirit speaking to him. When he catches her hand, he takes her in his arms, and she promises never to leave him. The next morning, they walk through the woods, and Jane tells Rochester about her experiences the previous year. She has to assure him that she is not in love with St. John. He asks her again to marry him, and she says yes. They are now free from the specter of Bertha Mason. Rochester tells Jane that a few nights earlier, in a moment of desperation, he called out her name and thought he heard her answer. She does not wish to upset him or excite him in his fragile condition, and so she does not tell him about hearing his voice at Moor House. So I wonder how long it took Charlotte to craft this chapter, because it is absolutely perfect.
Perfect.
Right? The reunion just hits all the right notes. I'm in my feels, and I'm so happy to have Rochester and Jane back together.
Yeah, and I read this chapter yesterday afternoon, and I know I was kind of wanted to hurry up and get this episode recorded, but I found myself just really consumed by it.
Yeah.
I know it was a long chapter, but it just flew by.
Yeah.
And I wanted more of it, and it was one of the first, I shouldn't say it like that, there's 37 chapters so far, but one of the first chapters where I was just disappointed that it was already over.
Oh.
Even though it does, in a way, it does kind of drag on a little bit. Like there's a certain point where like, okay, they're back together. Now what's going to happen? But
now we have banter and teasing.
Yeah,
exactly. Can't have too much of that.
But it's definitely, it's such a heartwarming read, you know, and unfortunately, the reunion may not be under the best circumstances, but it's still really charming. It really is.
I completely agree. I just love this chapter so much.
Wow. And what's funny was before we started recording, I went back and listened to our previous episode, and I mentioned in that episode when she's going back to Thornfield, I talk about how I always use the word vivid to describe the way that Charlotte has these descriptions of Jane's travels. And same thing happens with this one. So just like when she went to Thornfield, now when she goes to Ferndean, we get these really long, drawn-out passages of her getting there. And so I feel like
she does take her time describing like how secluded Ferndean is, and it's just covered in a wood and very like kind of damp and depressing maybe. But Jane's going to bring light to that place.
Well, yeah, she does a great job of kind of making the reader full of anticipation.
Yes,
because you got to imagine that's what Jane's going through as well, right? And
yes.
So that's I joke about sometimes I give Charlotte demerits when I'm reading this, but many more times I give her credit for just amazing choices,
as you should.
And this is one of those great choices that she made, where it's not like she just pulls up in Ferndean, she really kind of draws it out and okay, well now what? Oh,
right?
She's only at the edge of the property.
It really has to hit all these different tones. You have to feel what Jane's feeling. Like you said, the anticipation is important for you to feel. And also, the fact that Jane doesn't immediately tell Rochester that she's there. You get that delightful sense of anticipation that, okay, Rochester's going to figure it out soon. Pilot figures it out before Rochester does. It is just, it's so much fun. And it's so satisfying and sweet.
Oh, for sure. As I'm reading it, I'm a little shocked that he doesn't recognize her voice. Or I was going to ask you, do you think he's dreaming? Right? Is that why he doesn't?
I think so. I think it's more that he thinks he's imagining things, and he can't believe it, because I think a little bit later he does think maybe she's dead. Right? That he can't find her, so maybe she's passed or something. Okay. So yeah, obviously he's not in the right state of mind. Yeah,
he does seem a little confused, right? And but there is a great point, especially from a dramatic standpoint, as you're reading through this book, where he says, is it Jane? And this is her shape, and this is her size, and then she answers,
and this is her voice.
Yeah, that's so great. It's such a great moment. But yeah, but then I was going to mention it later, but I guess I'll mention it now. There's a weird mix of emotions in this chapter, because they are back together, but then Rochester's still not fully there, right? He seems like he's still, what was that word they used? Disconsolate?
Oh, yeah. That melancholy just pervades this chapter, because he's had a hard time living without Jane. And, when I read this chapter, I think, how can anyone think he is a bad person when he loves Jane so deeply and her losses cause him so much grief? I'd have to put that in there again.
Oh, okay. Well,
in defense of Rochester.
Yeah, because I just listened to the last episode, and we were talking about how when Bertha dies, you found yourself kind of revisiting some of his actions when she was still alive, and you felt it was a little irresponsible. But then now you read this chapter and you're like, "Aw, I can't be mad at you." It is sad to see him in this state, And I was going to ask you, what do you think must be going through Jane's mind? At first she sees him from afar when she's outside, and then when she goes up close to see his injuries, and also some of the way that he behaves, he just seems very sullen. I wonder. It's supposed to be this great reunion. I wonder, she's supposed to be so excited to see him, but yet that must be tearing at her.
Like she's disappointed that he's so broken down, or he's not quite the same man that she left. Yeah.
I mean, maybe is the shock going to wear off at some point?
There's probably a little bit of shock, but I think ultimately she still feels the same way for him. Nothing has really changed in that sense. So, she's only thinking, well, she knows him so well, so she knows that this is kind of where he would be at, just depressed, especially after losing his sight and a hand.
And his Jane.
It's like it's all piled on him. He must feel terrible. And Jane's just there. She really wants to cheer him up, and she wants to love him,
By teasing him.
Well, I do love that we get to see that side of Jane more in this chapter than I think we've seen in any other chapter before. There's that part in chapter 25, like right when they're engaged, and Mr. Rochester says to Jane, "Look wicked, Jane, as you know well how to look. Coin one of your wild, shy, provoking smiles. Tell me you hate me. Tease me, vex me. do anything but move me. I would rather be incensed than saddened. And you really feel that this is that section, that way that Mr. Rochester describes Jane is what you really start to see in this chapter.
Oh, nice callback.
Yeah, I mean, I always like that passage too. But yeah, Jane is very teasing and playful with him, and she's clearly very happy.
And that was a word that I had in my notes as well, was playful. You know, it's wonderful to see Jane being so playful, very sarcastic with him too. You know, since he seems to be acting, you know, over dramatically. At least that's the way that I read it. Now, maybe he is, like I said, he has this affliction, and maybe he just feels terrible about himself, but he does kind of go a little bit over the top, you know. And I feel like sometimes when people are acting like that, you kind of have to treat the situation with humor, you know. And I was going to ask you, well, when I was in college, when I took psychology classes, there was a term that I learned, and this definitely plays for Mr. Rochester in this chapter, which is histrionic, which is very sort of over dramatic. But I was also going to ask you, do you think he's being childish in any way, or do you really think he is just like, woe is me, I can't ever be happy again? Because it's like, Jane's back. I don't get it.
Well, you know, it's hard for him to believe that he's had these, as he said, dreams before where she was with him, and then he wakes up and she's gone. So he just doesn't know. And she left him before. Maybe she'll leave him again. You know, it's really, I think it's been a hard year for Mr. Rochester.
Yeah,
so it's not going to be easy for him just to bounce back. Okay. But I also like that Jane knows how to bring him back with the humor and the teasing and making fun of him.
Maybe as a reader, we just want this reunion to happen so badly. We just assume everything's going to be perfect. But you have to realize that there are some emotional
that's interesting.
entanglements that he's dealing with.
Interesting to know that it's not perfect, you know?
Well, at least for him, right?
Yeah.
Because,
I mean, probably not ideal for Jane. It's not what she would have wanted. But
well, sure, but they're back together.
Yes.
And I think, you know, again, as you're reading it, you're like, awesome, they're back together, the end of the book. But then it's like, wait a minute, no, he's still coming to grips with this. And I like that.
And it takes time.
Yeah.
No, don't leave me. I've touched you and heard you. I cannot give up these joys.
I will stay, I have said so.
To be my nurse? You're young. You must marry someday.
I do not care about being married.
You should care, Janet. If I were as I once was, I'd try and make you care. But a sightless block.
I took fresh courage, seeing now where the difficulty lay. It's time someone undertook to rehumanize you. You look like Nebuchadnezzar in the fields. Your hair reminds me of eagle's feathers. Whether your nails have grown like birds' claws, I've not yet noticed.
On this arm, I've neither hand nor nails. A mere stump.
It is a pity to see it. A pity to see your eyes and the scar on your forehead. And the worst of it is one is in danger of making too much of you and loving you too well for all that.
Well, I also wanted to mention, you know, Jane just converses with ease with Rochester because they're so well matched.
Oh, yeah.
You know, this is the perfect relationship for her. And I wanted to quote something that she says in this chapter where she says, "My spirits were excited, and with pleasure and ease I talked to him during supper and for a long time after. There was no harassing restraint, no repressing of glee and vivacity with him." And I wanted to say that I feel like that directly references how she had to act with St. John, where she had to repress sort of that vivacity of hers because St. John didn't really care for that. And with Rochester, it's just completely different. She's so happy, and I really appreciate that about Mr. Rochester in, you know, when you're comparing it to St. John.
Yeah, and like I said, Rochester must have played the reunion over and over in his mind, and I can imagine that Jane must have done the same thing. And now that it's finally happened, I think she's probably feeling relief. You know, she can finally be herself.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, it's happened. You know, it's probably not. Maybe it's not exactly like it happened in her head.
Yeah.
You know, he probably
and it could have been different too because maybe Bertha would have still been alive, and then Jane would have had to leave.
Oh yeah. So, yeah, exactly. That's a good point. So I wonder if because there's nothing in the way, and you know, now she can just kind of just revel in the fact that they're back together, and doesn't have to. There's no pressure, no societal pressures on her, no pressures from the housekeeping staff. You know. She can just sort of hang out with them.
So then, you know, another reason why I feel like this chapter just feels so perfect, pitch-wise, where you have a counterpoint to how Rochester used Blanche to make Jane jealous, which didn't seem to work as well for Rochester because Jane didn't express any sort of jealousy to Rochester. But Jane uses her relationship with her cousin St. John to make Mr. Rochester jealous, and Rochester shows that jealousy very well.
Oh, yeah. It's kind of funny, actually, because I feel like it's so out of character.
Yeah?
Because he's such a confident man.
Oh.
It seems like.
Well, yeah, that does show how he's changed a bit, probably.
Yeah, he's got money and he has some influence or whatever, but yet here he's just so insecure in that regard. And I do love that moment where right after Jane mentions how handsome St. John is, it says in the book, as an aside to himself, Rochester says, "Damn him!" And it's just like, because I could see him doing that.
Yes.
And I was going to say, yeah, did you enjoy how Jane gave him a taste of his own medicine?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like Rochester deserves it, and Jane is going to have fun with it too. So it helps, like Jane says, helps Rochester maybe consider less of his terrible depression. Just to think about. Well, I don't know how helpful that is if he's thinking about Jane leaving him, but Jane makes it work.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, there is a bit of a comeuppance aspect of it too, right? The last chapter we talked about how, like, maybe perhaps some Victorian viewers needed to see him become injured in a way for his impure thoughts or for trying to have a second wife, and so now he's. When Jane does come back to him, he's still getting a little bit of a ribbing.
Yeah.
It's like
it's not all sweetness.
Yeah, he does get a little bit of his what he deserves in that regard. Yeah.
And yes, in that vein, I feel like now it's clear Jane has the power now, because they are more truly equals. Rochester is not just the giver and protector, as Jane says.
Sure.
They have more financial equality, and Jane has experienced a little more of life. So it's a better relationship all around for her.
Yeah, she's wise beyond her years now. I feel like the age difference doesn't seem too drastic anymore. I mean, it's still there. They're clearly still 20 years apart.
Yeah.
But she seems like she's grown so much during her time with the Rivers family. Plus, the employer-employee dynamic is also gone.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I guess she still calls him sir sometimes, but there is that level of they've been through a lot, so they're two people who can comfort each other in this sad world.
Oh well, yeah, and I'm sure that she probably assumed that if their reunion, if they would have been able to stay together forever, it would have been at Thornfield. But maybe there's a part of me that thinks. Maybe it's the best that they're not there.
They need to start fresh, right?
Yeah. Not that specter of what's on the third floor.
Yeah,
or
all those memories.
Or if he kept the staff on, then they would have been
gossiping.
Yeah. So now he has a chance with a fresh place, whether it be Ferndean or if they were to go elsewhere.
Yeah. Rebuild Thornfield, maybe.
Yeah, for sure.
So towards the end of this chapter, we get Rochester's account of hearing Jane across the moors, which I think is a wonderful, like, eerie moment. That's just proof of their connection and true love. It's so romantic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like how she doesn't tell him that she heard him. We mentioned that in the Spark Notes. I guess it would have been so easy for her to say, I heard you, but I can respect that she wanted him to not believe it was supernatural. And at the same time,
it would have been too much for him.
Yeah. But at the same time, I thought it's kind of interesting that, like, she doesn't want him to believe in a higher power or higher being. But at the same time, did you notice how Rochester seems to be a lot more religious?
Oh, yes. I think that's an important point to make too, because that's also another way that Rochester is kind of redeemed towards the end. Because he's when he proposed to Jane, he is thumbing his nose to God, where he's like, I'm gonna take care of her, I'm gonna hold her, and I'm gonna keep her, and whatever, I don't care what God thinks anymore. And we have this reversal, and this is another way that Jane and Rochester can be together, is that Rochester accepts that God has had a hand in what's happened to him, and he has deserved it, and he's, now that he's praying more and stuff, it's again a more equal relationship, because they're both following God in a way that Rochester wasn't before.
Yeah, and they're different people. And it kind of brings up a good point, which is when I was reading the chapter, I asked myself, like, what would have happened if she would have married him? in chapter 26.
Oh, and Rochester was not married prior?
Yeah, like, I mean, or even if he was, like, I mean, I guess it's a two-part question for you. What if she would have went through with it? Because now you find yourself kind of, but Rochester kind of points it out, like maybe she should have reconsidered her departure from Thornfield. And I kind of wonder, could she have made it work? And also, you know, what if there was no Bertha back then? Would it have worked as well?
Oh, I mean, there's two different, you know, interesting conundrums of like, you know, I think Jane at some point, you know, while she's at the river, she kind of comments on what if she had married Rochester anyways or been his mistress, and she would have been like delusionally happy, but then also just really disappointed in herself, and I think just sad about the way that she's living.
Yeah.
And if Rochester had never been married and was free to marry Jane when he first proposed to her, now I wonder if maybe Jane would have butted heads more with Rochester because of how he showered gifts on her and wanted to make her into a grand lady, where she needed to have her own money to feel more equal to Rochester and not lose her independence.
Yeah, I feel like her departure really gave him a chance to reflect on what he had and what he might have done to like scare her off. Like you said, if he was coming on too strong and wanted to shower her with all this stuff, you know, his plans for her seemed to be more in line with his interest rather than a joint decision. You know, maybe he was so bewildered in love that it amplified some of these flaws, and Jane leaving kind of humbled him.
Yeah, that's very true. I think, you know, Rochester is also changed by this experience. He's a little less arrogant. You know, he's a little bit more concerned with how Jane's feeling or what she wants. So definitely, I think that Charlotte knew, you know, as she was writing this, it was all going to work out in the end. It worked out the best way it could after Bertha dies.
Well, yeah, that impediment, which I still think, who knows? They might have been able to make it work with the impediment if she was, because they just we as we've discovered with this chapter, their love for each other was so strong that
maybe just wait for divorce laws to be passed.
Something, right? Yeah, I think it would have been an odd arrangement, obviously.
Oh yeah,
but I think they would have made it work. It would have.
It wouldn't have been the best situation.
Yeah, they would have been happy to be together, and then whether it's blasphemy or whatnot, but
right. I mean, yeah, obviously either way is not ideal because now you have Rochester with his unfortunate infirmities, but they are better matched now, and I feel like he really needs Jane just like she needs him, and it's, again, equal.
Yeah, great point. It's funny what a difference a year makes. You know, I think they're much more suited for each other now. You know, it's great to see how Rochester hated to be waited on by his servants, but fully welcomes Jane doing it, right?
Wow, yeah.
You know,
I mean, I guess that's sweet in my mind, but other people might be like, "Wow, that's kind of rude." You know, you want to force Jane to take care of you?
Not force, because she seems to be happy to do it.
Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, I feel like we mentioned that Jane grew a lot in that year, and I think Rochester did too. You know?
Yeah, and you know, it's, you know, the main theme of this book, which is passion versus reason. Like, we come back again to Rochester becoming more religious. He's less driven by his passions. He's becoming more reasonable in the fact that he's acknowledging God and religion and all this in this book. So, you know, Jane had to balance passion and reason in her life, and Rochester also had to do that for them to become, you know, a better unit together. Yeah. And to have that happy ending.
There's a reason that they always say you don't know what you got till it's gone. Right? And that happened clearly, because if there was there's that word again, impediment, who knows? Would it have been this storybook romance? Yeah. I think having Jane go through what she went through, you know, with the Riverses and stuff, and then unfortunately having Rochester go through what he went through, it just makes their relationship that much stronger when they reunite.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What do we have for interesting context of this penultimate chapter?
Well, there are a lot of like references to different Bible quotes and things.
A lot of Bible quotes in this
yes,
one, yeah.
But I really wanted to focus in on a passage where, you know, Jane and Rochester, they're going to get married soon, and Rochester says, "Jane suits me. Do I suit her?" And Jane says, "To the finest fiber of my nature, sir." And I love that line because it's actually a quote from Charlotte's father, Patrick Bronte.
Really?
Because he also wrote. He stopped writing after his wife's death in 1821, but he was the author of 4 books, 3 pamphlets, and 2 published sermons. And of his books, 2 were in verse and 2 were prose. So they were called Cottage Poems, published in 1811, The Rural Minstrel in 1812, which was the year of his marriage, and The Cottage in the Wood in 1815, and The Maid of Killarney in 1818. So the finest fiber of my nature is actually a quote from one of his books.
Really?
Unfortunately, I cannot find which book that is.
You're just going to have to get those books.
I guess. I think they're a little bit hard to find too, but
no?
yeah.
There's no PDF of them? Somebody scanned somewhere?
I'll keep looking.
Well, to wrap up, what is your most meaningful passage or quote from chapter 37, Charlene?
Well, there are a lot of quotable parts.
Many.
And it's very difficult to choose one, but I've done it. And this is a very romantic way of Mr. Rochester expressing his feelings for having Jane back in his life. So he says when Jane comes down to breakfast, "Oh, you are indeed there, my skylark. Come to me. You are not gone and vanished. I heard one of your kind an hour ago, singing high over the wood, but its song had no music for me, any more than the rising sun had rays. All the melody on earth is concentrated in my Jane's tongue to my ear. I am glad it is not naturally a silent one. All the sunshine I can feel is in her presence."
Wow.
Right? It's so beautiful. I mean, Jane just has to melt at those words.
He's getting romantic.
Uh-huh.
She's the romantic one, I thought. But
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, Rochester's, he's such a softie, isn't he?
Yeah. And again, we're repeating ourselves, but it's a very romantic chapter. And now all these feelings are coming back to him now that Jane seems to be in there, if she exists or not. He's totally getting caught up in the moment, right? Yeah.
And I guess it's also a little bit the fact that, Rochester is blind and he feels like he can't do as much anymore. And Jane, he's just relying on Jane so much to kind of bring that life to him, which I just love.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it a little bit after the proposal and stuff like that. There was a few brief chapters in there. But yeah, he's definitely so much more romantic. It's so much more of a softie. I remember there was a part where she says, "Can you see me?" And he says, "No, my fairy, but I'm only too thankful to hear and feel you."
Yeah.
Oh, that guy.
All right. What's the romantic lines that you picked as your favorite passage from this chapter?
As I mentioned, very romantic chapter, but on the other hand, I chose a quote from Jane being really romantic.
Okay.
And it begins with a line from Mr. Rochester where he says, "And you will stay with me." Excuse me. He says, "And you'll stay with me." No, is that okay? Did he? Oh, yeah. Well, no, sorry. He says, "And you will stay with me." No. Okay, I believe he said, "You will stay with me." Or was it the part where he said, "And you will stay with me"? No? Was it that part? Okay, no. Okay, sorry. No. Seriously, he says, "And you will stay with me." And she responds, "Certainly, unless you object, I will be your neighbor, your nurse, your housekeeper. I find you lonely. I will be your companion, to read to you, to walk with you, to sit with you, to wait on you, to be eyes and hands to you. Cease to look so melancholy, my dear master. You shall not be left desolate so long as I live."
Oh, yeah. That's a beautiful passage.
Like I said,
and thank you for the retrospective of voices.
Yeah, I kind of had to bring them all back. I think I may have forgotten one in there, Neil Diamond maybe. But, who knew Charlotte was this romantic, right?
I think we all knew that.
I don't know. I wasn't expecting it. I feel like that whole passage, it's a great encapsulation of not only Jane's feelings, since she left, but it also kind of summarizes the entire book. You mentioned passion versus reason, but I mean, there's this notion of like, I loved you, but then I had to leave you, and now I'll never leave you. And I said, they're a perfect match. They need each other, and the readers are so glad that they have each other. All the other distractions are gone. I was looking back, the Reeds, Brocklehurst, Lowood, Blanche, Bertha, St. John, all of them are gone. And after all the adversity that Jane has faced, she deserves this life and this ending.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the whole arc of the book. We have one more chapter that kind of wraps things up for us, but I feel like this could have been the end. You have a famous line starting the next chapter, but Charlotte could have ended it here.
Yeah. I'm wondering how many times J.R.R. Tolkien read Jane Eyre, because it's got a total Lord of the Rings ending where there's just like, is it over? No, it's not over. No, is it over? No, it's not over, but
Well, I'm glad it's not over. We still have one more chapter here.
Yeah, I can't believe we've come to the end, and it's going to be a little sad to see it go, but all good things must come to an end.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.